General education classroom, IEPs, and professional relationships. Just a reminder, some characteristics of inclusion that are discussed within the context of your text that match up with the things that we discussed at the beginning of the semester are that we want students to be in their homeschool placement, that we want students to be in natural proportions in the school and in the classroom. We want to make sure that we are thinking about how we're providing teaching and learning. Students should be in age and grade appropriate placements. We should be trying to eliminate as much as possible any outplacements out of the school district or other more restrictive environments. And our ultimate goal is to make sure that we are increasing the amount of time that all students spend in general education classrooms. As we have students who are receiving special education services within the context of our general education classrooms, we want to think about who is setting up the program that that student is operating from. So who is responsible for being part of developing that student's IEP or individualized education program? In the state of Connecticut, we refer to that group as the PPT, which is the pupil planning team. It's basically a collaborative team. And the person who is the teacher at that student's grade level, at the middle school or high school level, typically one person who is part of that student's schedule will take responsibility for representing the entire group of general education teachers. The student's special education teacher, who is responsible for overseeing their plan, oftentimes in the state of Connecticut referred to as a case manager, would need to be part of that team, and an administrator. There must always be an administrator who is part of a PPT. It is actually not legal to go ahead and run a PPT without an administrator. A person is there to make sure that as supports are discussed, the supports that are being proposed for a student are, first of all, appropriate, and second of all, actually options that are available. So that's very important for the administrator to be there. There's other people that would be involved depending upon the nature of the student's disability. Those folks are considered to be related service providers, individuals like an occupational therapist, physical therapist, speech and language pathologist, psychologist, nurse, etc. could be part of a student's team. Students should be part of the team at some point. Typically, as you get closer to the end of elementary school, it's a good idea to ask students perhaps to come in for the last 5 or 10 minutes of a meeting, just so they start to understand the process. As students get into middle school and into high school, they should be part of that planning team. Some students will choose not to be. Some students will become stressed or anxious over participation in those meetings, but it's very important that we have their input. So if they are individuals who are not comfortable going to the meeting, then it's important that the teachers are discussing the kinds of goals that are being put into place with that student and asking for that student's input. The related service providers do not necessarily need to be at the PPT meeting. They can provide a written report, which needs to go out before the meeting if they're not going to be able to attend, and the individuals who are at the PPT can review the report that they've sent. What's important, though, is that they are available by phone during the course of that meeting. So if there is an occupational therapy report and the team has a question about what the occupational therapist is either proposing or some information that's in the report, that person needs to be available by phone to be able to answer questions. The other option that is now available, and we discussed this during the history component when we talked about IDEA, is that parents do not physically need to be in the room for the meeting. They can come in on a conference call if it's not possible for them to be there in person. The thing that we want to make sure that we kind of keep in mind as we are supporting students with disabilities within the general education environment is that it's really a collaborative relationship that needs to occur between the special education teacher and the general education teacher, and sometimes there may be other individuals that are part of this collaborative process. One of the things that you may see within the context of your schools are cooperative teaching, or what we typically see in the state of Connecticut defined as co-teaching. So what co-teaching is that there are two teachers who are certified in a particular area or licensed to provide services in a particular area who actually teach lessons together. They should have a class that is academically and behaviorally heterogeneous, with groups in educationally integrated settings. That is a general education classroom. Sometimes you'll see the speech and language pathologist or a school psychologist or a school social worker come in and teach a lesson with the general education teacher, and that could be considered to be co-teaching as well. There are several co-teaching models that are possible. There are videos that are linked to all of these so that you can see them actually being implemented. But the first one is one teach, one observe. And basically, one person is sitting back, oftentimes to collect data at a point in which there's a need to gather extra information. The second approach is one teach, one drift, or one assist. And basically what's happening here is usually the general education teacher is providing the lessons instruction, and the special education teacher is kind of moving around the room, keeping students focused, answering questions, and hopefully doing that with a variety of students in the classroom. This is a model that you may also see when there's a paraprofessional in the classroom, although I would not describe it as being a true co-teaching model because the paraprofessional is not a certified or licensed individual, but many times you'll see a paraprofessional who drifts or assists in a classroom. Station teaching, or which many of you probably remember perhaps from your own earlier educational experiences or from children that you know that have been in preschool, is that there are multiple things going on in the classroom at the same time. One of the advantages of station teaching is that the teacher ends up with a much smaller group of individuals, so you can see what the students are doing a little bit better. If you have students that are struggling, it's oftentimes easier to identify that. Station teaching is a really terrific approach. However, it is an approach that requires significantly more planning on the part of the teacher. Parallel teaching, both individuals have taken a group. They should be basically split in half, and one teacher is teaching one group and the other teacher is teaching the other group. One teacher may be using a slightly different teaching approach. Maybe one teacher is using a more hands-on approach. The other teacher is using maybe a more visual and auditory approach. You would group the students kind of based on what strategies you think would be best for them to experience. Alternative teaching is when one teacher is teaching the majority of the students and another teacher has a small group of students that they're instructing. One of the things that is really important to keep in mind, alternative teaching is not just pulling a group of special education students receiving special education to the back of the room to work with the special education teacher. Alternative teaching should also have a heterogeneous group of students who are working in a smaller setting. So there may be students who have missed several days of school because of illness, or some students that are just struggling with a topic, and maybe a few students who are receiving special education services. But it should not be a special education cluster in the back of the classroom. Team teaching or interactive teaching is really when the two teachers know each other really well and have worked together for an extended period of time, and literally both of them know the material and can present. So oftentimes it kind of goes back and forth. There may be one teacher is talking for a bit and another one kind of starts picking up from where they left off. This is really when you know that you have a fully developed collaborative team, when you can actually team teach. So after you've watched the videos, think about a couple of the models. What have you seen at the school where you intern or do your field experience? Did you see lessons that you thought were successful? If the lesson was successful, why do you think it was successful? If it was an unsuccessful lesson, why do you think it was not a successful lesson? Some ingredients for successful collaboration are that we need to have a voluntary relationship. If we ask two teachers to work together in a co-teaching model, it typically does not work well if they are not in that situation voluntarily. So if the principal just assigns them a co-teaching responsibility and says, you're going to make this work, I don't care whether you want to do this or not, that usually becomes a problem. They need to have a shared philosophy and mutual goals. So they need to talk about what their teaching philosophy is like, how they want to go about doing things. They need to understand how the other person operates in the classroom. If one teacher has an approach where students can get up and go use the bathroom whenever they want, and the other teacher does not let students get up and go use the bathroom whenever they want, there's going to be a conflict there that needs to be worked out before they actually start providing a co-teaching experience. They need to have time for communication. It's incredibly important that they have a common planning time, that they're able to actually make lesson plans together and map out who's going to do what and how it's going to happen. Co-teaching does not work well when the teachers don't have that time to communicate and plan together. When they're trying to do it 5 minutes before a lesson is going to start, or in the parking lot on the way out at the end of the day, it's often really not a successful model that you'll see in place. They need to share their responsibility for participation in decision making. So they need to be doing these things together. There shouldn't be one person who is doing all of the planning, or there shouldn't be one teacher who's doing all of the decision making and the other one is just following along. If that's the case, there's really no point in having two licensed professionals in the classroom. You might as well have somebody who is not a licensed professional, like a paraprofessional, in the classroom. It's significantly less expensive, and if one person is primarily running the classroom, a special education teacher is at that point kind of a glorified paraprofessional. We want to make sure that there's ownership of all the students. There shouldn't be my students and your students. The special education teacher should be interacting and engaging and participating with all of the students in the classroom, as the general education teacher should be with the students who have labeled disabilities. If there are things to be graded, they should be sharing in those things. It shouldn't just be that the special education teacher grades the materials that the students who are receiving special ed services have produced and the general education teacher does the others. There needs to be a discussion about roles. When two teachers have very different ways of approaching the classroom, it's really important that they're clear about who's going to do what, when they're going to do that, and so that they're not kind of stepping on each other's toes. Stability in a co-teaching relationship is really important. It works really well when two teachers are left to work together over an extended period of time. It does not work well when a special ed teacher is co-teaching with one teacher 1 year, a different teacher the next year, another teacher the year after that. It works much better when there's stability in relationships. The teachers oftentimes do not have control over the planning of who's going to co-teach. The administrators oftentimes pick who's co-teaching and who they're going to work with. That you can certainly offer some insight and information if you are part of a co-teaching model and the principal keeps trying to move folks around. You may want to encourage them to leave you with your partner. Sometimes administrators think that it's a really good idea to split up two folks who have been co-teaching and then put them with two other people. They think that they're sort of spreading the knowledge across the school. They would actually probably be better off to have those two teachers mentor another co-teaching pair as opposed to splitting up a relationship that's actually successful. So some benefits of collaboration. First of all, it gives everyone an opportunity to work with specialists and receive expert advice on working with a student. So the general education teacher has a great opportunity to get a lot of information about how to support that particular student with disabilities and will probably develop a number of other strategies that they're able to use in other classes or with other students in the future. It's an opportunity for everyone to participate in the planning and gain knowledge of all the goals and strategies. So the special education teacher will have a much more intimate knowledge of the curriculum for that classroom, and the general education teacher will have a much better understanding of the student's IEP. The student stays in the general education environment, which is always ultimately our goal, is that they stay in general education as much as possible. The additional support is brought to the general education classroom. There's an opportunity for the student to use the skills that they're gaining in the environment where they need those skills. It does not help when you ask students to leave the classroom and they go work on skills that they needed to be in the general education classroom, maybe interaction skills and other academic skills, and to put them in situations where it's where it's fake, and you're sort of creating an opportunity for them to use them in a segregated situation. More often than not, they won't be able to use them in the environment where they need them. They will not always generalize those skills. There's lots of teachable moments that happen in general education. There's lots of opportunities for them to learn other things from their peers. There's lots of opportunities to really build on communication and relationship skills within the context of the general education classroom. It's an opportunity to assess the student in the natural environment, going along with the discussion of working and using the skills in the environment where they need them. It's also important that you get an opportunity to see how effectively that student actually uses those skills in the environment in which they're typically used. So what I'd like for you to do is just stop for a little bit. Think about what happens when parents or families have children with disabilities, and what kind of information might they find if they were just out doing a general web search. If you take a look at some of the sites that come up when you put in maybe a particular disability or a particular treatment approach, think about how would a parent or family know that this is legitimately research-based information that they're finding, that it is not just some scam that someone has created. And how would you, as a professional, help parents and families process the abundance of good and bad materials that they can find online? You may find that you have a student in your classroom who has a family that has been seeking treatment or seeking perhaps an approach that they think is going to cure their individual of their particular disability. And sometimes some of those things that they find are things that are actually dangerous. Some of them, if they're not dangerous, they are at the very least not effective. Or they could be very financially draining and not effective. So what would happen if a family comes to you with a particular treatment approach that they would like to use, or a particular strategy that they would like to use? How would you help evaluate whether that's an appropriate thing to do? So just take a little bit of time and check out some things that you see online. Some other things we want to think about as we're thinking about professional relationships are connections to the family and the community. So one of the things that is really incredibly important at this point in time is that we have culturally sensitive educational practices. And it's really important to remember that as we think about providing a multicultural education, it's not just a curriculum. There's not just a steps that you're going to follow and you're going to suddenly have a curriculum that encompasses all individuals' cultures within the context of your school. It's really a commitment to making sure that we're providing an equal opportunity to all students, that we are sensitive to their cultural needs, and that we're empowering them within the context of the classroom. So some things we want to think about as we are building relationships with parents is we want to remember that you want to have a really positive attitude as you go out and start working with families. You want to start with a clean slate. Perhaps you know something about this family because one of your colleagues at the school has shared with you information about the family. Oh, I had this student last year, and these are some of the things that were going on, and these are maybe some of the problems that I had. I want you to go in with the idea that this is a new year, this is a new relationship, and really give them the opportunity for a clean slate. Try very hard to be as non-judgmental as possible. We never really know what someone else's reality is. So parents who don't return your phone calls, parents who are not maybe as available to you as you'd like, parents who have forgotten to send things into school that you've asked them to send into school, we don't really know what their full reality is. So you want to be as non-judgmental as possible. The other thing is you want to notice what they do bring to the table, what's good about their contributions in that student's life. Families know so much about the students that you have in your classroom. They may not necessarily be able to express in educational terms information that they know about their child, but they know a great deal, and many of them are working really, really hard to try to do the best thing possible for their child. You want an environment of mutual respect. You want to make sure that you are understanding and respectful of their beliefs and cultural traditions. Others' knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, families oftentimes know an incredible amount about the students that we're supporting, and lots of information that oftentimes is incredibly helpful to you as you're trying to get to know students within the classroom. You want to know what their priorities and values are. Sometimes we have priorities and values that don't match up with families. Sometimes we think it's really important for a student to learn a particular skill, and that may not be important to the family at all. So we need to make sure that we understand what it is that are their goals and their objectives for their family member. We want to make sure that we recognize the time and resources. Sometimes we have these great ideas that if we did certain things, and if the student went home and practiced these particular skills, or we had certain kinds of equipment that they had at home as well, that it would be helpful, that the student would have more opportunity for growth because there would be more opportunity for them to work on skills. But the reality is that families have a lot of other things that are going on. So expecting them to practice a lot of things or do a lot of extra things at home is oftentimes very unrealistic. So we want to make sure that we know what their time and resources are. We want to make sure that we build an environment of mutual trust. If you make a promise, follow through on it. If you're committed to do something, make sure that you do it. Be honest. If there's something that a family is asking you for that you know is probably not going to happen, don't promise them that you're going to do it. You might want to say, I'm going to check into that a little bit more. I'll get back to you with more information. Or I'm not really sure that we're capable of doing that at this point in time. But you want to be honest with them. You want to make sure that you're maintaining confidentiality. There's oftentimes that people know things about students who are getting special education services, and there are people who have no reason to know anything about that child except maybe perhaps their name. So you want to make sure that you're keeping information confidential. You don't want to be sharing confidential information in the teacher's lunchroom. You don't want to be standing in front of the mailboxes in the main office sharing information that should be kept confidential amongst the members of that particular student's team. You want to make sure that you establish a really good communication system. You want to have a regular opportunity to engage with the family, whether it's with email, texts. Some teachers are using the communication component of programs or applications such as Class Dojo as a way to keep in contact with families. You want to try to make sure that you have opportunities to say things to them that are positive. You don't want to just be calling them or texting them or emailing them when something is wrong. So you want to make sure that you would kind of build opportunities to tell them good things as well as some things that are maybe not going so well. As we look at the individualized education plan documents, there are some required components that need to be in all documents. So if you've had the opportunity to move from state to state and you see IEPs from other states, the format may be a little bit different. There may be things that are set up differently. There may be pieces of information that you've found on one IEP form that you have not necessarily seen on another. But there are some key components that are expected to be in an IEP no matter where the student is receiving their educational services. The student's present level of academic achievement and functional performance needs to be in there. There need to be measurable annual goals, including academic and functional goals. If the student is working on things such as moving independently in the environment, that should have a measurable annual goal along with maybe an academic goal about what that student is working on as far as, say, a reading or mathematics goal. It should be clear how these annual goals will be measured and reported, and it should lay out what related services and supplementary aids and services that individual is receiving. There should be information about how much they're participating in general education and in extracurricular or other non-academic activities. Any accommodations on state or district-wide assessments need to be laid out within the context of the IEP document. There should be clear start dates for services, anticipated frequency, location, and duration for those services. So if, for example, a student was receiving speech and language pathology services for, say, 30 minutes a week, that should be clearly laid out that that student is receiving a 30-minute session with the speech and language pathologist on a weekly basis. Is the speech and language pathologist going into the classroom, the general education classroom, to provide that, or is it a pull-out service? At age 16, there should be a transition plan. What is going to happen to the student when they age out of the educational system? For some students, they'll leave at age 18, they'll graduate from high school, and they will move on. For other students, typically those with more complicated disability issues, they will receive services up until the age of 21. So if you go to the Connecticut State Department of Education's website, you can review the Connecticut IEP document. This particular guide is set up for families, and it explains each section of the IEP in detail.